in a couple years ago, and I really enjoyed putting it together. The health impacts and environmental impacts of food choices is a topic I've had a great interest in for a long time. And putting that talk together a couple of years ago was fun for me, even though it was kind of a lot of extra work. So I thought, I should see if somebody else wants to talk about this. So I asked Scott, and finally we worked it into the program. So, like a lot of things in life, I've found about probably 10 different scientific papers that I thought would be cool to discuss. And we don't have the time, and I haven't had the time to put them all into the talk, but I've got a few papers that I think are pretty cool. We'll dive into them a bit and have some time for questions and answers. And as I was telling Landon at the beginning of this talk, when I gave this talk the first time, I kind of felt like in some ways it's probably preaching to the choir. I'm guessing a lot of the take-home messages here are not necessarily new for you, many of you, but hopefully, or maybe you haven't looked at some of the primary data as to why some of these recommendations have been made. And so, understanding how people have come to these conclusions and why some people make these recommendations, seeing the data behind that, hopefully gives you a new perspective on it, and maybe is of value to you. So that's kind of my goal, I guess, my goal tonight. So let me share my screen here so I can pull up my PowerPoint. I'm gonna make it a little bit smaller. Well, yeah, I guess I can't do that. So you guys see my PowerPoint slide, right? Okay, I see a thumbs up there from Scott. Great, thanks. So the January program, Eating Right for Yourself and the Planet, and I have to credit Scott for helping me come up with that title. So as I said, environmental impacts of food choices and health impacts of food choices have both been of great interest to me for a long time. And the nice thing is, a lot of the choices that promote positive health outcomes overlap with choices that decrease our impacts on the environment. And so that sort of has some synergistic interest there. So the first paper I'm going to start with talking about health impacts. And I have some other papers not listed here I could talk about afterwards in the Q&A if you're interested. One of the papers addresses both topics. So I'm going to talk about Springman et al. 2016 briefly, then talk more extensively about Levine et al. 2014. I don't know if I said 2016 there, 2014, which I know is about 7 years old, but this was a pretty big undertaking, published in a pretty high impact journal. So I think it's a great paper to review, and it highlights in the data in the cohort, it highlights some important nuance in in some of these general recommendations across different ages, especially people over 65 and people under 65, which may apply to some members of the audience. Differential recommendations in those two groups. So that's another reason I wanted to discuss that paper. And then environmental impacts, I'll start with Springman et al. So like I said, they sort of looked at some of the same dietary choices in both the health and environmental impacts. Eschel et al., again, another 2014 paper, a little bit older, but again, I think this was sort of a really landmark paper looking at environmental impacts of food production, mostly on various types of meat production. But I found this paper to be very interesting and really drive some of the advice we've heard, maybe some of us have heard in the press or podcasts or whatever, some of the data that really drives that advice. And then a more recent paper with some of the same group, some of the same authors as Eschel et al., Sheppen et al., 2018. And I only have one figure from that, but it's good to see that work is still continuing to be published in high impact journals, and therefore reviewed by peers in that field and validated by peer scientists who are experts in that field. And of course, with all of these, there's caveats, to any paper and limitations to any study. But, as we see more and more of these papers come out, we can hopefully have more and more confidence in many of these conclusions. So Springman et al. Here analysis and valuation of the health and climate change co-benefits of dietary change. And you'll see a lot of the papers looking at environmental impacts of dietary choices. They focus on climate change benefits because I think probably because one, I think as we're aware, climate change is a broad reaching environmental impact that touches on a lot of areas, and greenhouse gas emissions may be easier for these authors, for these scientists to study as sort of a proxy for environmental impact. But I'm sure you all can recognize that it is important for some of these other studies to look at other environmental impacts. And in the second paper, the Levine et al. 2014 paper, does touch on some of the other potential environmental impacts of food production. So we'll start with this, climate change and health, and we're going to start with the health, and then later look at the climate change. So the baseline, and this was published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is, again, a pretty high impact journal, which usually means the paper goes under a bit more scrutiny. If you're not familiar with how that works, usually means, in my experience, the paper undergoes a bit more intensive scrutiny. So generally, I would have a little more confidence in results from some of those higher impact journals. Again, there's caveats to that interpretation. So these authors start with a baseline of the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization projections for what's projected to happen in just raw calorie consumption across the world in the next 30 years. This starting point here is 2005 to 2007, because this was published in 2012. So, you know, it's getting on a bit in years, but still they're projecting out to 2050. And basically the take home point is, as people come out of poverty, which is a great thing, and people's disposable income becomes greater, people are going to tend to eat more calories on average. So you see across the world, people are projected to eat more calories in the next 30 years and across these various regions. So the baseline is based on what United Nations projects people would be eating with no interventions, I guess, in the following 30 years. And again, it's published here, and I can give you the reference, the more extended reference later if any of you are interested. So this is the baseline. Compared to this baseline, Springman et al. Compare a few different dietary interventions. So what if people adopted what's known as the healthy global diet, recognized by recommended by the World Health Organization? So they're saying, compared to those projections in this 2012 paper, sort of a baseline, if people adopted what the World Health Organization would recommend as a healthy global diet, about 5.5 million deaths would be avoided. Excuse me, sorry, I wanted to grab a paper real quickly, double check my notes on something. And so what is this healthy global diet by the World Health Organization? Well, I titled this Nail the Basics because these are all things that I think everybody's familiar with. Try to limit your sugar consumption. This particular model or projection is based on less than 50 grams a day of sugar. Eat lots of fruits and vegetables. This projection is based on if everybody started eating more than or equal to or more than 5 servings of fruits and vegetables per day. Oops, I had my animations out of order there. I apologize. Also, limiting red meat, something I think a lot of us have heard for a lot of years, although there is some pushback against that in some published literature. Limiting red meat to less than 43 grams per day. Again, this WHO recommendations. And then limiting the calories to 2,200 to 2,300 calories a day. And this, you know, touches on a lot of ways. It touches on a lot of things and can improve health outcomes in a lot of ways, just simply trying not to overeat. But they break this graph out, if we look at this figure here, in the total lives saved from all of these interventions, around over 5 million. And then they also break it out into, if the change was just adopting the fruits and vegetables, over 1 million lives saved. If the intervention was just limiting red meat consumption globally, then we see about almost 3 million lives saved. And then I think the delta weight is decrease in weight reduction as a result of limiting calories, or decrease in body weight as a result of limiting calories. So that's sort of nailing the basics. Probably not revolutionary to anybody, but maybe of more interest is looking at a vegetarian or vegan diet, which I know some people in the audience have an interest in. And these authors showed that going from that baseline to a vegetarian diet, we go from 5.5 million to 7.5 million lives saved. And again, they break down these changes in the green for fruits and vegetables, orange for red meat reduction, and blue for weight reduction. And I should mention, I'm going to have to check my notes for a second here. I should mention the vegetarian, rather than 5 or more fruits and vegetable servings a day, this now is 6 or more fruits and vegetable servings a day to get to that higher level. No red meat, poultry, or fish is considered in this vegetarian diet as defined by these authors. And at least one serving a day of legumes. And then going to the vegan diet, we see, another 1 million lives saved, which I guess in the context of this graph doesn't look that dramatic, but that is 1 million lives saved. That would be 7 or more servings of fruits and vegetables a day. Again, no red meat, poultry, or fish. 1 serving of legumes, and then no dairy or eggs, which is kind of the big hurdle for most folks in going from vegetarianism to veganism. And I do want to say, in full disclosure, I'm showing this in reporting some of the potential benefits of these choices when I myself am not a strict vegetarian or vegan at this moment. So I'm not trying to stand on a soapbox here and tell people, this is the thing to do. And of course I'm doing it. I'm not a strict vegetarian or vegan, but I think it's valuable to be aware of some of these things. Obviously, one of the caveats to this is that if going to a vegetarian and especially a vegan diet, you have to pay more attention to making sure you're getting full nutrients, the full complement of nutrients, but certainly something I think many people can accomplish, especially when you look at some of the potential positive impacts. Now, I spent some time going over this framework. We'll look at it again in the greenhouse gas reductions that these authors published in 2016. But with that, I want to move to Levine et al., 2014. Again, a little bit older, but the Cell family of journals is a pretty high impact family of journals. This is Cell Metabolism, which is a spinoff of the classic journal Cell. And importantly, I think for your interest, maybe this comes from a research group spearheaded by Walter Longo, and he's very active in the lay press. That you can find podcasts with Walter Longo. He's published. He's at UCLA. He's the director of this Longevity Institute at UCLA, and he's published some books, notably the Longevity Diet, which is talking about the impacts of what he calls a fasting mimicking diet, which is sort of a mild caloric restriction. And we can talk more about caloric restriction later. I do have a copy of this at my nightside stand at home. I haven't read it in a while, but my fiance loaned it to me because I think I mentioned this paper, Levine et al., and she said, "Oh, you might like this book." So from this group, this was a pretty splashy paper. The New York Times covered this. They looked at, again, I have to check my notes real quickly. Sorry, I'm going to zoom out. You guys can still see this one slide here, right?
Yes, we can still see it.
Okay, thank you. Great. So just to give you some background on this study, what did they do? So the title, low protein intake is associated with a major reduction in insulin growth factor 1. We're not going to talk so much about the growth factor, but that relates to the potential mechanism. Cancer and overall mortality in the 65 and younger, but not older population. So this is looking a lot at the percent of your daily calories that are protein and potential impacts on major health outcomes like cancer and death. So they used a national cohort of about 6,400 people, ages 50 and over. And supposedly this cohort is nationally representative. It includes a representation, broad representation of various ethnicities, various educational backgrounds, and health characteristics across the United States. 6,400 people is a pretty big group. It's not massive. And how was this done? That again, potential caveats there. They interviewed people about what they had eaten over the last day. So 24-hour dietary recall. And then the people, they also said, was that sort of a normal daily diet for you? And 93% of the subjects said, yes, what I just told you is sort of my normal daily diet. The caveat is and then they tracked these people for, I think, as much as 18 years. So long longitudinal tracking on the health outcomes, but it's all going back to that one snapshot of what did you eat that day and is that representative of your diet? So that's a major caveat, but nonetheless, they went on to do studies in mice and in yeast to give further credibility to some of their findings, and we'll talk about those. Okay, so that's how this was conducted. A snapshot. So the first major figure is looking at how long people will live on the y-axis at a certain age, at a particular age on the x-axis. And then we have 3 different lines across this graph. And we're talking about, and this is people dying from any reason. So predicted time till death for any reason, which could be getting hit by a car, diabetes, cancer, whatever. The long dashes are people that had a low protein diet, which is defined as less than 10% of your total calories from protein. The shorter dotted line is moderate protein intake, which is defined as 10 to 19% of your daily calories from protein. And then the solid line is the high protein group, again, based on that 24-hour recall. People that reported having more than 20% of their daily calories coming from protein. So you notice maybe you'll notice the trend here. If we look at the younger years, 50 to 65, if we look at somebody who's 50, this first dot on the line, and they're in the low protein group based on their self-reporting, they're projected to live another 33 years. And that's based on tracking these 6,400 people for 18 plus years. If you were reported to be in the high protein diet based on your self-reporting and you were 50 years old, based on following those people for 18 plus years, you'd be projected to only live for another 27 years. And moderate protein is somewhere in the middle. So what the authors report is that increased protein consumption is associated with an increased risk of dying for any reason. But that is age specific. So if you follow these lines out to about 65, which is the key, sort of the line, dividing line where they draw where they change their recommendations for people, you may notice that above age 65, the solid line, which is the high protein diet, starts to look higher than the low protein diet and the long dashes. So above a certain age, the authors report about 65, the relationship is actually inversed. High protein diet is associated with a decreased risk of all-cause mortality. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. By the way, I guess, I don't know if this is okay, but I'm okay with you guys shooting out questions as we go. So, if you want to throw something in the chat, I can keep my eyes peeled on that. Because, this may be, go ahead.
If I see something pop up, I'll help you with the chat.
Okay, thank you, Landon. I know sometimes with a lot of information, you think of something and then 20 minutes later, don't. So all-cause mortality, they broke this out and looked at mortality from cancer, mortality from diabetes, and mortality from cardiovascular disease. Again, in the same cohort, following the same dietary report. And cancer, the trend was even more striking. You see the long dashes, the low protein group, the level of protection from low protein, the level of protection against death from cancer in the younger people is even higher. And then as you go older, again, high protein seems to be protective above about the mid 60s, even against deaths from cancer. I see a chat here. So is it essentially that 65 and older should have less protein, or the inverse? Want to make sure I'm following here. Okay, thanks, Tricia. Okay, you followed it. Yes. So just to reiterate, thanks, Tricia. Just to reiterate, again, this is just one paper. So I do want to caution you. I also meant to say, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not a healthcare provider. So whatever you take away from this, definitely strongly encourage you, discuss with your healthcare provider, do some of your own research. I'm happy to chat with you later if you want to elaborate, but I definitely don't want to be responsible for you making any major changes that could impact your health without you talking to your healthcare provider. And that's also important just for my own liability and comfort. But just to emphasize, Tricia wanted to follow up. It does appear that based on this study, at younger ages, under 65, a lower protein diet is protective against cancer-caused mortality and all-cause mortality. Above 65, a low protein diet appears to be a risk, an increased risk of all-cause mortality and cancer-based mortality in people above 65. In other words, as you get above 65, you should consider increasing your daily protein intake. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. And this trend is even more striking for diabetes. I'm not going to show you the graph on that just because the authors point out that the number of people in this cohort, if you divide out these three groups, the number of people that actually die from diabetes is a very small number. So the error in that measurement is probably greater. But the same trend was observed for people dying from diabetes and was even more striking. Now, some takeaways in text. The impact of protein seems to be age specific, as I've said. For people, and again, their cohort started around the age 50. So this does not include data on people below the age of 50. But I'm guessing there's other research out there. So between ages 50 to 65, again, this is, don't want to check with your healthcare providers, but high protein was 74% more likely to die of any cause, 4 times more likely to die of cancer. So those are some takeaways that were in the text. Rather than looking at the graph, sometimes this text could be more striking. 4 times more likely to die of cancer. But, furthermore, if you compare moderate protein to low protein in ages 50 to 65, there's also a risk there. 3 times more likely to die of cancer just from the moderate protein group versus the low protein group in the younger members of this cohort, the members between ages 50 and 65. Importantly, these risks were associated with the consumption of animal protein and not plant protein. So they don't really have a good graph to show you about that. But in the text, they say that if they do the same analyses and control for the amount of animal protein or the amount of plant protein, that striking difference in mortality risk goes away, which suggests well, the analyses suggest that it's really high levels or moderate levels of animal protein consumption, not plant protein consumption, that is the risk factor here. Now, again, that's based on people reflecting on their last 24 hours of meal, but you can find additional papers further exploring these things. And, and we can talk about some of that more at the end if there's time. So for those, if you're a vegetarian or vegan, I eat a lot of tempeh, for example, which is a fermented soy product, because as an athlete, I'm concerned with getting enough protein for athletic performance. And, choosing a plant protein hopefully helps lower my risks. But as I said, the impact of protein seems to be age specific. So for people 65 and up, high protein people were 28% less likely to die of any cause and 60% less likely to die of cancer. Again, the same message, but maybe more relatable when we're looking at numbers written instead of that funny graph. And even moderate protein versus low protein in the people above 66 or 5 were 21% less likely to die of any cause. And again, associated with animal protein, well, actually, I left that bullet point there. I think I need to delete that. I'm not quite sure about the animal protein and plant protein in the older adults. I think get the protein any way you can above that age. And that's what I tell my dad, who's above 65 as well. Now, interestingly, we said, well, this is just based on people reflecting on their last 24 hours of meal. The authors, to get a really high impact paper and really be convincing, scientists not only have to show correlations, they also have to show causation. So they went on to do some studies in mice and in yeast to show if we feed these mice or these yeast high protein or low protein diets, do we see a causative relationship in something like cancer progression? So they have a lot more figures than I'm going to show you, but this is one that I thought was relatively easy to interpret and drives the point home. And this is what's looking at what's called tumor progression. They have another graph showing tumor incidence, but I think this is more striking. So this is in mice, and they put tumors into mice. So, a bit sad, especially if you're animal rights and animal welfare is of great interest to you. We're not going to start talking about the use of animals in medical research here, but nonetheless, they took mice and implanted tumors into them in order to do these studies to make sure we can be confident in these conclusions. They fed the mice high protein or low protein diets, and you can see that in these mice that were fed high protein diets, the tumors grew much more quickly than in the mice fed low protein diets. And if you read Walter Longo's book, he suggests that some of this fasting mimicking stuff and limiting protein can potentially, I think his group might even have some clinical trials going on with dietary interventions for cancer treatment. And I found another paper sort of hinting at that as maybe something in the future. But again, I don't have the data or much to talk about there. So something in mice, a causative relationship in cancer progression. Not showing mortality here, just cancer progression. And then in yeast, what really shocks me is, this relationship, and it turns out if you look further into the research, and we can talk about this at the end if you're interested, this really relates to strongly conserved, highly evolutionarily conserved biological reactions to essential amino acids. And you can see this even in yeast, yeast with extra protein, 2 times amino acids in their media, versus yeast with limited amino acids in their media. The yeast with the extra protein died more quickly. We have a sort of a baseline as 1x in red. Extra protein in black, you see this line dropping off. The y-axis is survival. So in the black line, we see the yeast surviving less. In the black line, which is the high protein group, double protein, double amino acids. In a yeast in the blue line that have half the normal amino acid content, if you look at their percent survival, they don't die as quickly. So, again, people could also say, well, what do yeast have to do with people? There are caveats there, but some biological phenomena are so strongly conserved in evolutionary history, you can see those relationships across a broad array of organisms, going all the way down to single-celled organisms, all the way up through human beings. And then one more intervention in mice to sort of further test this idea. They wanted to look at whether or not they could replicate that age-specific finding of protein intake in the mice. As we said earlier, above 65, high protein seems to be protective. So the authors hypothesize that above age 65, weight and muscle loss is a significant risk factor for mortality or morbidity. And they cite some research. There's, I think, plenty of research to show that above age 65, rather than gaining weight, people tend to start losing weight, and they're definitely losing lean muscle mass at a pretty rapid rate. So they're speculating, based on that correlative data, that longitudinal study, that the higher protein diets may protect against this weight loss and maybe this muscle loss in older adults. So they wanted to measure body weight in older mice, 24-month-old mice in red, and younger mice, 18-week-old mice in black. And in panel A on the left, they have mice fed a high protein diet. 18% of the calories are protein in this group on the left in A. And they have an exaggerated case, and they admitted this was exaggerated because they wanted to really see if there was an effect. But only 4% of the calories in these mice in panel B were protein, which is a very protein restrictive diet. Nonetheless, in the high protein diet, body weight was stable in older mice and in younger mice. Black and red lines, pretty stable across 30 days. Consistent with what they suggest is the potential mechanism in people. The younger mice in the low protein diet lose a little bit of weight, but relatively stable across these 30 days. These mice that are 18 weeks. However, the older mice in red at 24 months, you can see when they're fed this low protein diet, you can see their body weight around 10 days dropping off quite a bit and stabilizing at a body weight that's 10% lower on average. Well, maybe not 10%, but quite a bit lower on average than the younger mice. So they show in mice, some data that is consistent with this idea that low protein diet may contribute to weight loss and likely contributes to skeletal muscle loss in older adults, and therefore may be a risk factor for all-cause mortality, dying from any reason. So what are the takeaways? I think, I've already stressed these a bit, but just to write them out, one of the takeaways the authors recommend is that for people under 65, the normal recommendation, I had it written down, the Food and Nutrition Board of the Institute of Medicine. Currently, the Food and Nutrition Board of the Institute of Medicine recommends for most people about 1 to 1.3 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day. And that's sort of a standard metric to talk about, well, how much protein are you eating for your body? Because obviously a 200-pound person, the amount of protein I eat needs to be different than a 100-pound person. And I'm going to give you an example about that in a minute. But the authors recommend that instead of these guidelines being 1 to 1.3 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day, it be decreased to 0.7 to 0.8 for individuals under 65. So that's like a roughly 30% decrease in the recommended protein intake. And the recommendation obviously is adults over 65 should attempt to increase dietary protein, it seems, based on this one cohort of 6,400 people and what they've seen in mice and yeast. Well, mice, I should say, not yeast. Now, to give you an example, me, I'm about 90 kilograms, about 200 pounds. So 0.7 to 0.8 grams of protein per day for me would be 63 to 72 grams of protein. So something I eat pretty regularly would be like a can of sardines. A can of sardines is like 20 grams of protein. So that'd be like 3 cans of sardines in the day and no other protein. But obviously, you know, bread, nuts, lots of other things have protein. So they're saying 63 to 72 grams of protein per day. Instead of the current recommendations for someone of my body weight would be 90 to 117 grams of protein per day. So another example might be Cliff Bars. I don't know if anybody's ever eaten a Cliff Bar. It's a common, you know, snack food. It's marketed for exercise. They've got about 12 grams of protein. So, you know, 9 to 10 Cliff Bars per day would be, would get you in that, would get me in that 100 grams of protein per day benchmark. Now, granted, if you're, you know, this is just a broad recommendation and everybody needs to consider their own specific scenario. If you engage in strength training, for example, or resistance training where you're lifting weights or doing push-ups, any sort of resistance, then you can increase your skeletal muscle development or growth by being closer to the high end of this 1.3 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day. And that's another study I found, I'll just mention as an aside, a meta-analysis by Tagawa et al. 2020 showed that increasing protein consumption up to 1.3 grams per kilogram body weight per day could potentially increase lean body mass, lean muscle mass, but going above that 1.3 will not increase lean body mass without resistance training. So I may have misspoken a minute ago. So even people that don't engage in resistance training, Tagawa et al. Suggest if you're down around this 0.8 and you go up to maybe 1.0, you may increase your lean body mass, which is a, you know, potentially positive health outcome. But you have to take that in parallel with the findings from Levine et al. And if you do engage in resistance training or you're an athlete, then you may, you know, and you have to weigh the trade-off of athletic performance with your risk of overall long-term mortality, then you may consider going above 1.3 grams per kilogram per day. So pause for a minute in case there are any questions. I think that's the end of my Levine et al. Discussion. A pretty cool paper, I think, and pretty interesting findings. I think it's really cool. They did experiments in yeast. They have a broad 18-year-long longitudinal study on people, and they did causative studies on mice. So that's the end of the health section. Now let's talk a bit about the environmental impacts of food choices. Oh, wow. I guess I don't have a ton more time. Okay, great. So just looking at the clock there. Yeah, okay. So Springman et al., Eschel et al., Shepin et al. Shepin's really short. Eschel's the one I want to spend the most time on. Springman was the first health paper we discussed. So looking again at sort of the nail the basics idea, compared to the, I think it was, let me double check. Compared, what was our baseline again? United Nations. Compared to this United Nations baseline, excuse me. Compared to this United Nations baseline, if people adopt those WHO standards for a healthy global diet, which basically, you know, don't eat too much red meat, don't eat too much sugar, watch your calorie intake, shoot for about 2,200 calories a day. If people just followed that, which isn't a super extreme thing, they report there'd be a pretty dramatic decrease in greenhouse gas emissions. I think these are gigatons of CO2 equivalents. So a decrease of 3 gigatons in CO2 equivalents. If everybody went vegetarian, you can see a even bigger difference. So going from 3.5 gigatons to 7.5 gigatons, so almost doubling the decrease in greenhouse gas emissions. So really, I don't know if you recall the health difference. The health difference, I don't think was as striking going from this healthy global diet to vegetarianism, at least in this study. But the environmental impact is pretty striking, is almost a doubling. Veganism, a bit better environmentally, at least just talking about greenhouse gas emissions, which I admit, and I'm sure many of you would point out, is just one potential measure of environmental impact, and there are other important measures that need to be considered. And again, so this is an important point that we're going to talk more about. Notice the biggest part of this bar is the orange part. And the orange part relates to the reduction in red meat consumption. So a takeaway from this is, even ignoring all of these different dietary interventions, just reducing or eliminating red meat consumption, you can get the majority of this reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And this is Springman et al., published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, as I mentioned. And importantly, this is a different research group than the next paper I'm going to report, because sometimes people will say, oh, those scientists are biased, whatever their bias is, they have a bias. But if you look at the authors of this publication, it's a totally different lab, totally different university than the next paper I'm going to discuss. And both of them point out this red meat factor. So this is a major paper, Eschel et al., 2014. I don't know if some of you have heard some of the stuff from this, but looking at, this is where we're looking at all these variables: land, irrigation, water, greenhouse gas, reactive nitrogen, and reactive nitrogen burdens of meat, eggs, and dairy production in the United States. So looking at the different animal proteins, what are the various environmental impacts? So this is looking at the amount of resources of the indicated resource, in this case, greenhouse gas emissions, the amount of the indicated resource needed for somebody to be able to eat a megacalorie, which is 1,000 capital C calories, or 1,000 kilocalories, which would basically be like half of your daily calories for most people. So the amount of resources needed for one person to eat about half of their food. From dairy, well, anyway, basically dairy, beef in gray, beef in red, poultry in orange, pork in pink, eggs in blue. And then this hashed line indicates that this beef in red is off the scale. So take home point, if you want to decrease your greenhouse gas emissions, just like the last paper showed, eat less beef, eat less red meat. And here, for interest, this is wheat, potatoes, and rice in greenhouse gas measurements. So if you want to compare those. So this beef versus other animal protein, 5 times more greenhouse gas emissions. So this is off the scale, but it's about 5 times more. Here, in terms of fertilizer, reactive nitrogen needed, about 6 times more fertilizer needed to produce 1,000 calories of beef versus 1,000 calories of these other animal proteins. And here we see potatoes, wheat, and rice. 2 to 28 times more land required for the beef production. And the reason there's the broad variance is whether or not you consider pasture as being open for using for other things. If you conclude that, if you consider all the pasture that's being used for beef production, then beef is using 28 times more land than these other sources. But some might push back and say, well, all that pasture land can be used for other things. So beef, cow production isn't restricting that land entirely. So even if you cut out all the pasture land, just land for growing the food for the cattle is twice as much land needed as the other animal sources. And 11 times more water, and that's not shown. The land and water are not shown here, but I could show if you wanted. So Importantly, they also in parallel show in the average US diet how much of the animal-derived calories come from these various sources. So 12% of American animal-derived calories come from dairy, 7% of animal-derived calories come from beef, 6% of Americans' animal-derived calories come from poultry, 4% from pork, 1% from eggs. So I would argue we definitely as a country have room for rebalancing, right? If beef is by far the most intensive, 2 to 11 times more resource intensive, we could probably eat a lot less of it and save a ton of resources without even going vegetarian. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard this before. I'd be interested to hear how much of this stuff you guys have heard before. But again, maybe you haven't looked at the particular data. Okay, and we're just about done. So that's my last slide on Eschel et al. 2014. So Sheppen et al. Comes from the, is working with Eschel. So this is a similar research group. I think they've moved to a different university, but Sheppen is the lead author. This came out in 2018. So this is a follow-up, sort of keeping in the same spirit. And they actually have another 2019 paper that's pretty interesting. But let's look at Sheppen for a minute. The opportunity cost of animal-based diets exceeds all food losses. Well, what do they mean by that? That's the takeaway point. Another way to say that is more food, much more food is wasted in animal food production than the amount of food wasted in producing plant foods. So one of the key points in their abstract is a third of all food is lost between the producing it and getting it to people's tables. And that's things like food spoiling, food, falling out of a truck, who knows, all the different ways food can be wasted. So the first example they start out with, the only example I'm going to show is using poultry. So they're starting off here on the left, showing the yield of crops that have to be grown to feed people plants that people would eat for protein, or plants that you could feed to chickens as a source of protein. And the reason that animal crop protein is higher is because the kinds of plant foods we feed to chickens are generally higher in protein than the plant foods that animals eat. So at the very beginning, the crops grown to feed to chickens has a higher rate of return in protein, or a higher rate of return. Now, going from the food that you're growing to feed to chickens to actually feeding it to chickens, there's a bunch of loss, right? To go from what you grow to feed to the chicken to actually getting a chicken to eat, you're losing a bunch of crop. But the plants you grow to feed to people, you don't have to feed them to animals. So there's no chance to lose feed in sort of a middleman. You just take them directly to the people. So the amount of crops grown to feed the chickens goes from up here to way down here because of the loss of feed when you're feeding it to the chickens and getting it to the chickens. So they call this the opportunity food loss just from feeding the chickens. And then, of course, going from getting the plants to people or getting the chicken to people, there's additional loss. And after all that's said and done, you can see there's a loss in plant, but going from all of the crops grown to feed to the chickens to the chicken that gets on your table, there's a much greater loss of resources and crops. So their studies are suggesting that food waste is exaggerated through the production of calories, of animal-based calories. And one more paper from Eschel et al. It just came out in August 2019. I haven't had time to dig into this one, but I just thought I'd show you this research is continuing to be published in peer-reviewed journals, and there's more out there if you're interested. This one is entitled Environmentally Optimal, Nutritionally Sound, Protein and Energy Conserving Plant-Based Alternatives to U.S. Meat. Because one of if you look at some of the papers published pushing back against this, they'll say, well, those vegetarian diets are nutritionally deficient. So here they're trying to say, well, you can structure a nutritionally complete plant-based meal and still have a huge decrease in your environmental impact. I'll just skip this slide. That's an aside. So thank you. I think time's about up, but I'm happy to answer questions or talk more about anything that I know more about. Thank you very much. My time is up, right? About